Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. This is basically an emergency episode. When I first reached out to our guest, Peter Harrell, months ago at this point, I wanted to talk to him about U.S. trade policy. He's got a tremendous background. He's a Yale lawyer. He's got 6+ years of advising U.S. companies on sanctions compliance and geopolitical risks. Served in the Biden administration, served in the Department of State. Like, he's done a lot of things that make him a really, really educated commentator on the nitty-gritty of tariff policy and the legality of tariffs and all the sorts of things that often sort of fly over the heads of the top-down geopolitical analysis. But it just so happened that as we had to push and delay, Peter was able to come on literally on the day that the Supreme Court started hearing arguments about the legality of the tariffs themselves. So we recorded Wednesday, November 5th around noon Central New Orleans. We're going to get this out as quickly as possible because it's hard to get through the gobbledygook of the legalese that is being thrown about at the Supreme Court level. And I think Peter does a good job of cutting through that and getting to, okay, what's at stake here? What are the different arguments? And then what are some of the potential impacts on all parts of the economy, from the macro right down to the individual investor? So hope you enjoy the episode. If you have questions, comments, concerns, as always, you can hit me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com. Take care of the people that you love. Cheers and see you out there.
No, I mean, I follow you online, so I feel like, it's one of those things, like, I feel like I know you, but, we don't actually know each other, right? That's just sort of the way the world works today.
I know, and I try and reach out to the people that whose work I really do follow and value so that we can actually, put faces to names and go from there, but you never know who's going to respond.
Totally.
Okay, but Peter, we're recording Wednesday, November 5th. It is 12:07 p.m. here in New Orleans, I guess 1:07 p.m. Eastern for you. And you just got to watch your Super Bowl. You got to watch the Supreme Court hear the IEPA tariff case, and I bet I've already put at least one listener to sleep with even the invocation of just that jargon. So listeners, it's a treat. We have a Princeton grad, a Yale lawyer who's going to talk to us about, honestly, Peter, what has been one of the hardest things for me to integrate into my analytical framework right now, because I don't know what the Supreme Court is going to say about tariffs. And if the tariffs mostly go away, like in 3 weeks or whenever they rule, it's kind of a big effing deal compared to everything that's been going on with the Trump administration. So what are your first thoughts after watching this first volley of arguments over the past few hours?
Well, it was clearly a court today that was pretty skeptical of the government's argument that IEPA, this 1977 emergency powers statute, authorizes Trump to impose the full suite of the tariffs that he has imposed under the statute this year. I mean, just what are the tariffs we're talking about that are issued in the court? These are the universal and reciprocal tariffs, like when he says 15% on the European Union or 20% on Vietnam. We're talking about those tariffs here. And we're also talking about the quote unquote fentanyl tariffs on Canada and Mexico and China. What we're not talking about is the steel and aluminum tariffs, the semiconductor tariffs, the kind of product specific tariffs. But there may be, you think of it kind of numerically, it's probably about 70% of the tariffs that he has imposed this year are at issue in this case. And you heard a court that was, frankly, even with some of the most conservative justices like Alito and Thomas, expressing clear skepticism that IEPA authorizes the full suite of tariffs that Trump has imposed. Now, it was interesting listening to the, questioning, and, we're all just crystal ball gazing. These guys ask tough questions and see what it means when they get to opinion. What was interesting is you could sort of see some of the justices seeming to think, this emergency power statute doesn't authorize any tariffs. You'd also see some of them, like Alito, potentially like the Justice Kavanaugh as well. They were like, well, maybe if there's a real emergency, it should authorize tariffs, but, would it really authorize the scope of all these tariffs that we've seen today? So I think we're going to have to see where the opinion actually comes down. Is it, all the tariffs are junked, or maybe will some of these tariffs hold up in court, even if many of them are junked, but certainly lively. I did not envy John Sauer as the Solicitor General, who had a very, very, very tough day. Of course, Trump, we all know, is a very forgiving boss. I'm sure if the Supreme Court rules against him, he won't be angry at Mr. Sauer at all. He'll just be, you did your best, because that is, of course, the Trump we all know and love.
Yeah, The Apprentice was about you're hired, not you're fired, right? That's
Right,
the way
exactly.
we should. Well, man, we have so many different directions we can go, but why don't I be surrogate listener for a moment, and why don't I ask you sort of the simple question, which is, let's back up a bit. Tell us what IEPA is, and tell us kind of what the legal scaffolding the Trump administration has put behind the tariffs that they've put in place, and then maybe we can pick a little bit at what they said today.
Well, let me first actually, Jacob, pick up on a point you made in your opening, which is I think the fact of the legal uncertainty here has been one of the hardest things to include in all of our kind of geopolitical analysis, right? Because we're looking at Trump. He's imposing tariffs. He's using tariffs to negotiate deals. But like this is all against a backdrop that we might find at the end of this year, all these tariffs go poof, or many of them go poof because of the Supreme Court, and that's like hard for people who are thinking about geopolitics to kind of price in. Like how does that influence our geopolitical analysis, and so I think that's been a real issue on the geopolitical front. But to answer your immediate question here, so IEPA is a 1977 statute that Congress passed to give the president authority to do things like impose financial sanctions and trade embargoes when he finds that there's a national emergency. So the first time it was used was in 1979 by President Carter to impose sanctions on Iran. Every president since has used IEPA to impose sanctions and export controls and things like that. President Biden used it in 2022 to impose sanctions on Russia after Russia invaded Ukraine. It has never before been used for tariffs, and much of the reason why it's never been used before for tariffs is that it doesn't include the language tariff or tax. What it says is the president may, quote unquote, regulate ... the importation or exportation ... of any property. And the Trump administration's view is for regulating the importation of property includes the power to tariff it. But like no previous president has thought regulate means tax. They've all thought, well, maybe I could, require you to get a license to import it or export it, or maybe I could, say you can import it if it meets certain conditions or things like that. So Trump is sort of that's the sort of legal question: does regulate phrase mean tax or not? The reason Trump likes it over other statutes, there are lots of other statutes that impose tariffs. And during Trump's first term, he used something called Section 301 to impose tariffs on China. Totally lawful action, was upheld by the lower courts. The reason he likes it is, Trump really loves being able to turn tariffs off and on overnight at the stroke of a pen, and to, threaten. He sees a TV ad he doesn't like, and he wants to threaten, 10% additional tariffs, and no tariff statute lets you do that. The tariff statutes all basically say you have to spend months of your life doing a detailed fact finding, investigation, and then you have to like notice and comment the proposed tariffs. Like you have to go through a lot of process to use these other statutes. IEPA, you don't. Trump's not a process guy. Let's be honest. He's just not a process guy.
Yeah, well, I have to confess to you, I want to get back to that geopolitical level that you talked about. I'm not a lawyer, but I can read, and I have read the Constitution, and the Constitution fairly clearly says in Article 1, Section 8, that this is Congress's power to do these things, and that it is not in the purview of the executive. And I can see how you get Section 301 or 232, like laws that have been passed that carve out these things. And if the Trump administration has gone through those processes, as they did during the first administration, like, okay, I get that. But it seems to me on the face of it that like they're clearly illegal. Like you don't need a law degree to like look at the Constitution and look at what they're claiming and say that it's illegal. I mean, is it like that for you, or is it a lot more ambiguous? Am I making it too simplistic?
So I very much am with you. I mean, I am a lawyer. It had, frankly, until Trump's first term, it had never even occurred to me that IEPA might authorize tariffs. And I say that as somebody who, I was at the State Department for 6 years from 2009 through 2014. And I actually did a lot of work with IEPA on Iran sanctions. This was in the Iran nuclear deal era. I did work on the first time Russia invaded Ukraine, various other Somalia sanctions. I actually was involved in a lot of IEPA, and it just never occurred to me that this thing could authorize tariffs until during Trump's first term, he threatened tariffs on Mexico under IEPA. He never actually imposed them, never signed an executive order, kind of faded away, but he threatened him. And that was kind of the first time it even like does not feel, does not read to me like this thing authorizes tariffs. And that is held true this time too. Now, that's not to say, as you sort of dig into this, the government is totally without arguments. I mean, I think any natural reading of this statute would be this doesn't authorize tariffs. I think the best reading of the statute doesn't authorize tariffs. The government does have some arguments it can make. So for example, in 1971, President Nixon imposed for 4 months a 10% tariff on many imports to deal with balance of payments issues. And an appellate court, it never went up to the Supreme Court, an appellate court ended up upholding those tariffs in part based on IEPA's predecessor statute. So not on IEPA, but on this law going back to World War I, that's similar to IEPA in many ways. So like the government can kind of point to that and say, well, there was a similar statute back in 1971 that did authorize tariffs. They also just sort of assert that, we read regulate as including a power to tariff because, like, of course, right? Who doesn't think regulating includes a power? I mean, you just sort of assert that argument. But it would certainly, to me, be an unusual reading here to think that regulate means tax. And as you say, like constitutionally, the government conceded today, Congress has the power to raise tariffs, whether, because Congress wants to pass laws to regulate trade with tariffs or because it wants to directly apply tariffs. The government conceded this was a congressional power. And so the question is just, did Congress give the president that power when it passed IEPA? No one's sort of asserting, at least as of today, that the president has some inherent authority to tax all of us at whim.
Yeah, it's an incredible sleight of hand to say that Congress has given them the power to do that when, as you say, the word tariff is nowhere in the bill. Like I'm really struggling, like just on the face of it, with how to wrestle with that. But another question I had is, if you listen to President Trump talk about this in recent weeks and really recent months, he has not been making legalistic arguments about why the court should uphold the tariffs. He's been more of an outcome person. He has said things like, we need the tariffs because it's going to be a catastrophe for the country. If I've been turning on and off the faucet of these tariffs, then you're just going to sweep the rug out from underneath me. Is that a legal argument for the court? Like, can the court look at what is happening and say, okay, maybe it's not a good faith reading of the IEPA law, but now that we're this far down the road, if you took the tariffs down, you could create an emergency. And there's this, rather than a process-oriented point of view, that the outcome could be an emergency, and then you can read back into it. I don't know. I'm really stretching there, but I'm wondering, is Trump on any solid ground at all to say, hey, if you take these down, it's going to be a catastrophe? If the court believed that, does that open the door for them at all? Or is it, no, like we have to do the process and the formula of the law here?
So first of all, I find this argument kind of facially absurd, Jacob, for the following reason. Like, same logic to me would apply. The president could come down to Louisiana and confiscate your house and sell it and use the money to do some great thing, right? To build a rare earths factory or, what, probably wouldn't pay for a whole rare, but use the money for some great thing. And on the government's logic, they'd say, well, sure, maybe it was illegal that we seized Jacob's house and sold it, but look, we need it for the rare earths now, right? I mean, it's the same logic that of kind of ends justify the means that I think would be absurd in most contexts. That said, it is the argument the government is making, and I think part of the reason the government is making that argument is they understand at some level their strictly legal arguments are shaky, and they are hoping to kind of, politically persuade the court that there would be all kinds of bad real world outcomes if they took this tariff power away from Trump, and sort of by putting, the political pressure on the court via the threat of bad outcomes, hoping the court somehow creatively reads the tariff authority into IEPA. I think substantively the challenge I have with that is, aside from like this would be absurd in any other context, is at the end of the day, like, what would happen if we had no IEPA tariffs? We would have to go back to the tariff situation we had a year ago with Trump using the trade tools he used in his first term. And, I don't know. I mean, I was alive all through his first term and through the last couple of years. And certainly I think we need to do more to rebuild our industrial base. But it's hard to argue that the country was in some sort of catastrophic freefall, just as a factual matter.
Yeah, it is pretty hard to argue that. What if the court does declare the tariffs illegal? What happens the next day? Could the court give an adjustment period for the tariffs to be withdrawn? Is it just the day that they rule that they're illegal, they go away? How do both foreign countries and also U.S. companies start to prepare for if the court does rule in the direction that we're talking about here?
Yeah, so that came up just a little bit at the arguments today. It's interesting, both at the arguments today and in a lot of the briefings to the court, there actually hasn't been a whole lot about, kind of what will happen with the tariffs that have already been paid and that sort of thing. That said, I think those of us who've been tracking this quite closely have obviously been thinking about what would happen if they are ruled illegal. And I think you'd see a couple of things happen. So first, the Trump administration has said publicly, especially earlier this year over the summer, they've said publicly that they are working on a plan B to reimpose some of the tariffs under other laws if they lose this case. They've actually been kind of quiet on that recently, I think because they understood that it is not helpful to their case. When on the one hand, they're going in and saying the world will fall apart if you take this tariff authority away. And on the other hand, Kevin Hassett and Peter Navarro are going on CNBC and saying, if that we lose this case, don't worry about it because we have all these other things we can do. There's just some, there's some tension in the government's argument there. I think the practical reality is what you'll do is you'll see them scramble to recreate some of, but not all of these tariffs under other legal authorities. So, for example, there is a statute that is called Section 122, which lets the president impose 15% tariffs for up to 150 days on a kind of the U.S. is suffering a balance of payments problem. I could see them trying to invoke that statute to maintain 15% tariffs for 5 months while they work something else out, right? That's the buy time approach.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Vietnam tariff rate comes down to from 20 to 15 in that scenario. The Canada tariff rate comes down from, I guess, 35 it is, or, he moves the Canada tariff rate around on whim every day. But I think it's 35 today. That comes down to 15. So it doesn't maintain everything, and it can't go beyond 150 days. But, that maybe that buys him a couple of months. So that's sort of question one is what do they do to try to put some tariffs in place on a go forward basis? Then the question is okay, if you're Walmart, you've paid a bunch of tariffs, do you get your money back? And I think the argument, I think the legal answer is pretty clearly you should be entitled to get your money back. I mean, it's funny, I talk about this with friends. I'm well, if the government came and confiscated 60% of my income as some sort of tax, and I won in court that they can't take 60% of my income as a tax, of course I should get my money back. And the tariff is no different, right? It's just another tax. So if you've paid, if a tax has been illegally extorted from you, you should be able to get your money back. That said, I could see a scenario where Trump tries to make it, very hard to get your money back. He kind of says to, Walmart, yes, legally you might be entitled to your money back, but, I'm going to drop as many anvils on you as I can if you actually try to get your money back. And, we'll have to see how that plays out in practice.
Yeah, which, Walmart can do that. The small to medium-sized enterprises that have been affected by tariffs can't either stomach that or probably have even less capacity to go at them. Let me ask the flip side of the question. It sounds to me like you're saying that it's not likely that the Supreme Court is going to uphold the tariffs, but if it did, if they found some legal justification to do so, what would your takeaways be about the Supreme Court as an institution, about U.S. institutional legitimacy in general, about like the role of law, the rule of law, and U.S. politics? Like, if the unexpected happens, what is your takeaway then?
Yeah, and I think we have to take seriously. I mean, I think especially after today's hearing, the odds are well above 50% that the court will rule against, at least most of the tariffs. Maybe there'll be some small category that it leaves upholding, but I think it will rule against at least most of the tariffs. But I think we have to take seriously, it could come out the other way. When this was at the appellate court level before it came up to the Supreme Court, the appellate court did rule against the tariffs, but there were a couple of judges in the appellate court who dissented and kind of laid out in the dissent how you could, if you wanted to legally uphold these tariffs, how you could do so. I think that if the court upholds these tariffs, it will be because the court, some justices of the court have a very expansive view of presidential power, and so are comfortable kind of giving the president more and more power. B, because the court decides it doesn't want to pick this fight with Trump, right? Trump is engaged in this kind of public intimidation campaign against the court. The world will fall apart if you take this away from me. And, maybe politically some justices would decide that they, don't want to pick this fight. I think both those things are bad for U.S. institutions, right? You would have a court basically saying, we are prepared not to be a co-equal branch of government, but to let the president intimidate us. You'd also have a court saying the president has a basically unbounded power over international commerce that I think, we would see potentially expand, not just, with tariffs, but like, for example, I think if the court agrees with Trump on its interpretation here, Trump would also be able to use the statute to impose taxes on inbound and outbound capital flows, right? Because it's regulate import or export of property, and outbound investment is property moving out of the U.S., right? So I think you'd have a pretty unbounded kind of international transaction taxing authority that I bet we'd see Trump discover over the next couple of years.
To get even a little more in the weeds, I wanted to ask you also, because I don't have a firm handle on this myself. I've sort of been treating my geopolitical analysis of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada relationship as fundamentally different from everything else the administration is doing, because it seems to me that it's all a soap opera leading into renegotiation of the USMCA going into next summer. How is the Trump administration, like, for instance, threatening tariffs against Canada, even as we have the USMCA technically on the books? Like, I have not quite figured out how Trump can do that on the one hand, and yet the USMCA still exists and theoretically covers most of the trade between those countries. Can you help me there?
Yeah, so I can unpack a little bit what is going on legally, and then I can unpack politically what I think is going on. So legally, Trump has, by and large, exempted products that comply with the USMCA agreement from his new tariffs, and certainly from his IEPA tariffs. So if you look at products we import from Canada, probably 80 to 90% of them comply with the USMCA agreement, meaning like they can show they meet North American content standards, that kind of thing. And right now, those products are not subject to IEPA tariffs. Now, some of those products, like car parts, are subject to other tariffs, like Trump's car tariffs, which are not IEPA tariffs. But when Trump says we're having 35% tariffs on Canada, or maybe now it's 45%, it actually is only on like 10 or 20% of the stuff we import from Canada, which might, for example, be some product that's coming in from Canada that is, mostly made in Europe and then gets a little bit of, finishing done in Canada. So sort of legally what's happening is Trump is basically using these high tariffs on a small share of U.S. imports from Canada to put pressure on Canada to agree to big concessions in the USMCA renegotiation with kind of the implicit threat of, hey, if you don't agree to these changes, these high tariffs that currently apply to only 10 or 20% of your trade could apply to a lot more of your trade. So that's legally what's happening. I think politically what's happening, and Trump just like for a long time has not liked Canada and sort of feels like he can kick him around and enjoys kicking him around. And, Trudeau, former Prime Minister Trudeau, kind of let Trump kick him around for a while in a way that set a bad precedent. The other thing that I think Sheinbaum, if I look at North America, Sheinbaum has both done a better job of managing Trump. I think we have to give her a lot of credit for the way she has managed Trump. And then the other thing I look at, it's interesting on the geopolitics, Jacob, because I think, during the transit late last year, early this year, we all would have said, well, immigration is going to be, and the migration issue is going to be a huge point of friction between the US and Mexico. And of course, it is a big point of friction. But I also think it's in some ways interestingly been a stabilizing factor, because I think the immigration hardliners in the Trump administration understand they kind of need Mexico on board for migration issues. And so they've been telling Trump, like, you can't kick Mexico around too much on the trade front because we need them to help us secure the border. Whereas with Canada, like, you don't have the same, like, it just doesn't matter as much. And so Trump is sort of doesn't need the Canadians for sort of a geopolitical reason. And so he feels a little freer to kick them around.
Yeah, well, and on Mexico, it's not the 1990s. The people who were showing up at the border in the last couple of years of the Biden administration were not primarily Mexican; they were others,
right.
And so Mexico has the exact same problem. So the U.S. is dealing with a Mexico that is willing to play ball there. Yeah, it's just strange to watch the Trump administration do this, because if what you said is true about that sort of legal balance with how the Trump administration is using USMCA, but then also trying to use tariffs as leverage. I mean, if you're Mark Carney, you must just be sitting here eating popcorn like you are, watching these rulings and saying, okay, well, everything that he just threatened me with for the past 6 months, he probably can't even, get support in the courts of his own country, let alone like actually enforce these things. And if you're any other country, like you're South Korea or Japan or you're Brazil, it's risky to do this because, as we've said, there's a non-zero chance the Supreme Court finds some way to justify a lot of these tariffs. And then it's not like the Trump administration is just going to stop. They'll try and find all sorts of ways to get around them. But it just gives him a whole lot less leverage in his negotiations and talks with a lot of these countries if they can just sit on their hands and wait for the Supreme Court to undo the things that he's threatening to do. Is that the right way to read it, or do you think that that I'm shorting the amount of leverage that Trump has in threatening these tariffs, even with what's happening at the Supreme Court level?
So it's interesting. So I actually think, very few countries, like let's posit Trump loses his case in 2 months. I think the Supreme Court will take a month or two to make a decision here. These are not people who, feel compelled to get things out the door in a day or two. But I also don't think they'll wait till June. In theory, they could wait till June. I don't think they'll wait till June. But let's suppose that, Christmas time, we all get a Christmas present of a big tariff cut because of the Supreme Court rules these tariffs are illegal, or, Hanukkah cut if you're Jewish. And what do I think these foreign governments do? I actually don't think the foreign governments kind of walk away from the deals. And I think there are a couple of reasons they don't walk away. I think part of that is, they understand Trump could and probably will over some period of time recreate some of these tariffs. So, they have a practical reason not to walk away. The other thing is that for a number of these countries, one of the things they get out of the deals is relief from non-IEPA tariffs. So if you're Germany, one of the things you get out of the EU deal is your car tariff. And again, the car tariffs are not done under IEPA. They're done under another law. Prior to the EU-US deal, you were paying 27.5% on cars, or really the U.S. importer was paying. Your cars were subject to a 27.5% tariff, and they're now subject to a 15% tariff. So like you kind of, like on cars, sensitive topic, like you get a lower rate irrespective of how the deal comes, how the IEPA tariffs come through. So I think you don't walk away. What I think you do is for the harder things you put on the table, like, you promise you will lower your tariff rates on US goods. You promised you would, allow US big tech companies like better market access, whatever it is. You put some promises on the table. Um, I think you probably slow walk implementation of those while you see what Trump does to recreate the tariff. So you don't sort of like
Mhm.
provoke a huge fight, poke Trump in the eye, risk his ire, or you just kind of like, we're very glad that, the courts have found these tariffs are illegal. We've always been against these tariffs. But that's a domestic issue within the United States. Well, take our time implementing these deals while we see what Trump does.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. Um, as we're thinking beyond Trump, because we did have some important elections in the U.S. just yesterday, and it was a good night for Democrats. You had Democrats sweeping in Virginia. You've got Mamdani in New York City. I guess we can argue whether that's good for Democrats or not, based on how senior Democrats have tap danced around Mamdani. That's a whole nother rabbit hole we could go down. What's happening in New Jersey. I mean, one of the things I want to ask you is, irrespective of whether the court upholds or doesn't uphold the tariffs themselves, has President Trump fundamentally changed how the White House interacts with tariffs in general? Like, if we get to, let's say, a Democrat wins the next presidential election, do you think that they will sweep away all of these deals and sweep away all of the unorthodox things that Trump has done in his second term? Do you think Biden didn't get rid of any of Trump's China tariffs? Do they just keep them on the books and keep pushing, and therefore we look at Trump as some kind of trendsetter when it comes to U.S. tariff policy and the use of economic policy? I'm trying to get, it's hard now because we are so in it and we've got 3 years to go, but has he done permanent, lasting change to how the U.S. Authors trade policy, I guess, is the question I'm trying to circle in on.
Yeah, so I think he has. But first, on the political results last night, I think it is a very was obviously a big win for Democrats. I live in Georgia, and like below the radars, we did not have major races, but we had two statewide public service commission. You guys who regulate utilities, and even there, here in Georgia, two Democrats won. This is the first time Democrats have won statewide other than in U.S. Senate races, like at state level races since 2000, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So actually, you saw even in down ballot kind of things, you saw a very good night for Democrats last night. And I do think one of the reasons you saw a good night for Democrats last night, it's not just sort of generalized unhappiness with Trump. It is a sense that like Trump has not brought prices under control. And and so I do think actually election results last night might make it a little bit more likely that both parties, putting aside Trump is all in on tariffs and is going to be all in on tariffs for the rest of his life. Like there's just no changing his mind on tariffs. So I do think the election results last night will potentially reinforce a little bit of tariff skepticism by both many Democrats and by some Republicans. That said, I don't think that we're going to reach a point where kind of all these tariffs just go away overnight in 3 years, unless the courts just get rid of everything.
Mm-hmm.
I think and that's because, tariffs, we've seen historically, they become sticky. We've seen, politically, they become sticky. As you note, Biden ended up keeping not just Trump's China tariffs, but also Trump's term one steel and aluminum tariffs. So I
Mm-hmm.
think probably what we would see, down the road might be, some kind of hybrid approach where, if Democrats came back into power, they might make some of the tariffs on consumer goods just go away. Coffee tariffs get ended on day one. Like tariffs on socks and shirts. Just end on day one. Like I could see some of the consumer tariffs going away as sort of we're cutting taxes for working Americans kind of framing. But then I think there will be political incentives and political, constituencies who will resist removing some of the tariffs. And the question is going to be, what do Democrats do there? Do they let them for those sort of tariffs that feel stickier, do they make hard decisions and get rid of them? Do they try to negotiate them away? Like, well, we'll get rid of these because we get something. Like, I think that's going to be a very interesting dynamic. I look back at history, and we all know about Smoot-Hawley, the Tariff Act in 1930, right? Because we all watched Ferris Bueller, and we all had we all know the famous scene with Ben Stein, right? So we all know the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Last time tariffs increased like Trump has increased them, quite literally, it's the last time tariffs went up like that. But actually, and it's true that it wasn't until after World War II that we fully got rid of Smoot-Hawley, but during the 1930s, Cordell Hull, the Roosevelt Secretary of State, got Congress to pass something called the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act in 1934. And between 34 and 39, so prior to World War II, or prior to U.S. entry into World War II, negotiated 19 trade agreements that actually began to bring down the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see something like that. Some tariffs unilaterally go away. The next president negotiates away some other tariffs because politically he finds that easier to do than just giving them away. So I don't think tariffs remain where they are today, but I also don't think they're going back to where they were, 12 months ago.
Well, yeah, and probably some of this depends on how the economy fares in general.
Yes.
We've already seen. Oh, here, I'm trying to talk to you, and I suddenly have a commercial going in my ear for a truck. I don't know if you could hear it.
No, I couldn't hear it.
There's a subliminal message in there somewhere. But, there was a vote in the Senate, what was that, last week? Time has no meaning for me anymore, where 4 Republican senators voted with Democrats to approve a resolution to repeal President Trump's tariffs in general. Now, you don't have enough Republican testicular fortitude to do that yet in the House, but you can imagine if inflation rises and if you get some shocks in the economy and if you can tie it politically to tariffs, that maybe you would see a revolt in the House. And maybe the question is moot. Maybe by the midterms, we're talking about Congress sort of pushing back against it. But I don't know. That still feels like a fairly out there scenario.
Yeah, I agree. I do think we'll see, as you say, we saw 4 Republican senators vote against Trump's tariffs. We've seen the House, because Mike Johnson basically won't allow the House to vote on tariffs. We don't really know what the number is, but on public comments, you probably see. Just on public comments, you probably have a half a dozen or a dozen House Republicans who've expressed skepticism of the tariffs. And I bet that if there was a vote, you'd actually see a slightly larger number voting, especially from the, Republicans from farm states, right, who've been hammered because of foreign retaliation, cutting off farm exports. You do have this tariff skepticism. So, yeah, but to me, that doesn't mean they necessarily get rid of all of them. But I do think we're going to see, I think we have seen and will continue to see political support for this level of tariffs be underwater.
Peter, I just assumed you were in D.C. Where in Georgia are you?
I live in Atlanta.
You live in Atlanta. All right. Well, I grew up an hour east of Atlanta.
I commute to I'm in D.C. a couple times a month usually, but no, I'm actually live in Atlanta.
Well, there we go. I love having a fellow Georgian on the podcast. I'm lost down here in the bayou, but Georgia.
Beautiful state, though. Louisiana is a beautiful state.
Yeah, if you like swamps, it has a certain charm to it. It can. One thing I wanted to ask you, because we're focusing a lot on IEPA and, of course, these Supreme Court rulings, but you had a series of interesting thoughts I thought you put out around some of the deals that the Trump administration made with Cambodia and Malaysia a couple weeks ago. So I wanted to set you up to talk a little bit about that, because as we move away from the legality of the tariffs or not, you had some interesting insights about what that was telling us about Trump's trade policy and maybe the ways that the U.S. is trying to make deals with some of these countries, might even be bearing fruit. So that's the softball. I'll let you knock that one out of the park.
It's a great question. And, I think when we, when we look at Trump's trade deals, I think, or Trump's negotiation of trade deals going back, 4 or 5 months now, one of the questions I think a lot of us have had is the Trump administration serious about using trade deals to get U.S. trade partners to make meaningful commitments on China. If you talk to folks at USTR, you listen to Jameson Greer, it was clear Jameson and some of the folks at USTR wanted to use these trade deals to get meaningful commitments on China. But, those of us who don't know the administration, just watching from the cheap seats, like, unclear if Trump cares at all about that. And sort of, will the administration really push to get China commitments in these deals? Or, really all we care about is how many soybeans do you buy and how many Boeing aircraft do you buy, right? I mean, it's sort of been an open question. I think what we see with the Cambodia and Malaysia deal, so these are the first two where we don't just have like a, sort of 4-page MOU, but we actually have something that begins to look like trade deal text. I think what we see is actually, oh no, the Trump administration is at least reasonably serious about using these deals to negotiate cooperation on China in a couple of different ways. And I'll highlight just a couple of interesting things that were in these deals. So first, on the tariff front. So, we are increasingly in the U.S. using our tariffs on China to protect strategic industries, like autos, like critical minerals, this kind of thing from Chinese imports, low-price Chinese imports. Under these deals, the Trump administration can notify Malaysia and Cambodia that we, the U.S., have imposed a tariff or non-tariff restriction on a particular product from China. And the countries are then on the hook to take a, comparable action, which doesn't necessarily mean like exactly the same tariff rate or something, but, sort of a comparable reaction. So like that's, okay, a collective wall against China. That's interesting. We'll have to see if it's implemented, right? The Trump administration said we will notify these countries. They will then act, but like we'll have to see if it's implemented. But like that's an interesting idea that we'll have sort of cooperation on, at least on a couple of products, TBD tariffs on China. Both Malaysia and Cambodia also agreed to adopt investment screening mechanisms. It's unclear what the timeline is and how that will look, but, seem to adopt something like CFIUS. Seem to commit to adopting something like CFIUS, which is an interesting, development from countries that haven't historically done that. Malaysia also committed to making sure that U.S. companies could invest in critical sectors in Malaysia. So if you think about competition with China, part of it is keeping the Chinese out of the investments, but part of it is making it easier for U.S. guys to come in. And Malaysia, again, there's written commitments in there that'll make it easier for the U.S. to invest in minerals and in telecom and energy and other key sectors. Similar language. Well, there's a nod to that in Cambodia, but it's more general in the Cambodian agreement. So there's some interesting provisions that to me suggest USTR is pushing hard. Let's use these agreements for some meaningful cooperation against China. But on the other hand, they are sort of, commitments to cooperate in these different areas. And we do have to see implementation still to know how real and how meaningful these things will be.
Well, yeah, and the Trump administration has their deal on China now, which we'll see what it is. I've been advising clients and listeners to pretend as if a deal doesn't actually exist because I don't know that it's going to be there. But I did want to get you out of here on this because I know that your time is precious today. But if you start looking at what the Trump administration is doing, I can't help but wonder if tariffs have always been leverage and not the thing that they were actually going after. Because you start actually digging through, they're making a trade deal with China. And you've got Pete Hegseth saying, relations have never been better between the United States and China. Yes. You've got exemptions seem to be proliferating left and right when it comes to what tariffs are going to be on. You've got most favored nation status that countries can apply for once they get the deal, or if they're dealing with sensitive products, or somebody's whispering in Trump's ear that they need this thing, so then they can apply for these sort of things. It sort of seems to me 12 months from now, we might be in fundamentally U.S. trade, like the tariffs won't actually be the thing that we should be talking about. Like actually trade will be much more like it was before, or maybe you'll have some things rerouted, but it won't be such a stark change versus what we've seen the Trump administration threaten so far. Pick that apart for me. Am I being overly sanguine, or do you think there's some merit to that?
So I think there is, Jacob, some merit to that. I think there's not complete merit to that, but I also think there's not zero merit to that. And first, let me pick up on something you just said, which is, we are seeing this proliferation of exemptions in the tariffs, and I think that is kind of underappreciated when from folks who are just kind of watching the headlines because Trump doesn't like to talk about the growing number of exemptions. But if
Mhm.
you read the actual implementation of the tariffs, you are seeing a growing number of product exemptions, ways you can apply to get your product exempt, things like that. So we are seeing a little bit more flexibility. And I guess the way I think, and I do think Trump, as we see, wants the deals. He wants to close deals, and he's willing to bring down tariff rates in order to get to deals. That said, one thing Trump has been very, very clear on, despite arguments that his Solicitor General made to the contrary in today's Supreme Court argument, is that he wants tariff revenues. And I say, so the Solicitor General argued, no, we're not trying to raise money from these tariffs. We're just, the regulatory measures. But Trump, of course, has been very, very clear that like part of the goal of the tariffs is to raise revenues for the U.S. government. And if all of the tariffs go away, you don't have revenue tariffs. But I think, so where I sort of think about this from a macroeconomic perspective, if, tariffs coming into Trump term two, or maybe putting aside China, an average tariff, applied tariff rate of like 3%, something like that, 3.5%. And if they are today, maybe 15 or 16%. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that average tariff rate come down to, like 10, 11%. A
Mhm.
lot of variation on products and countries and whatnot, but average maybe comes down, 10% or so. Which would be an average rate that for a lot of products actually would not encourage onshoring, right? You're not going to onshore garments for a 10% tariff, but that do let him claim he's raising 200, 250 billion a year in revenue, kind of as a tax on consumption. And so that's kind of where I think this, where he might see, although he'd never articulate it this way, he and his advisors might see the landing zone.
This is the portion of the conversation where I start to feel like Walter from The Big Lebowski, which is because what you just said when you translate it is that he wants the tariffs to raise revenue, which is he wants to impose taxes on U.S. consumers to increase U.S. government revenue. And somehow the Republican Party has closed ranks around raising taxes on the U.S. consumer, but it's okay because we don't call them taxes, we call them tariffs. And that means that Trump can do whatever he wants. It's an incredible sleight of hand. I just don't, in the same way that I don't understand how you can argue that IEPA allows you to go against Article 1 of the Constitution. I am still baffled that all you have to do to hide a tax on a consumer is to call it a tariff, and they won't sort of consider it a tax going forward. Like if Trump came back and said, you know what, okay, the tariffs have been ruled illegal, I still want to raise government revenue, so since we can't do tariffs, we're going to have to raise income taxes on
Yeah,
Americans.
no, I mean, no one would vote for that. No Republican would vote for that.
No Democrat at this point would
Yeah,
probably
no
vote
one,
for that
right?
either, the way
No,
that things are
exactly.
going. So
Exactly.
yeah, it just shows you it's we've been down so long it looks like up to me. I'll give you the last word. So for folks who don't have Yale law degrees or for the uninitiated, what are the things that they should be watching for as we go forward with these arguments, and what does it mean for everybody from somebody who's holding stocks and thinking about the U.S. stock market to the small to medium-sized business that is thinking about tariffs? Like how should they be thinking about the uncertainty that's coming through next?
Well, I think the good news for potential good news for small and medium-sized businesses in particular is that if Trump loses the IEPA tariffs, well, he will be able to recreate some of these tariffs under other authorities. there will be a lot more process around that. They'll have to do investigations. They'll have to notice, for comment, tariff rates. So you may end up still having to pay more tariffs than you did a year ago, but it'll be more predictable, and you won't sort of see your tariff bill, fluctuating week by week based on the whims of the government. I think that'll be very good news. And to a point you made earlier, Jacob, I think we were all cognizant it is actually the small and medium-sized companies that are facing the worst brunt of this. Because, as you say, like if you are Walmart, if you're a huge importer, A, you can probably afford more of it. B, there might be kind of complicated games you can play to try to avoid some of the tariffs. It just aren't options for the SME guys. So I think it'll, if Trump loses, even if he can recreate some of the tariffs, it'll be good news for the SME importers. Bad news, and I do worry on stocks. Like, obviously, if Trump loses the tariffs, will probably be, turns out the markets don't really like the tariffs. Who would have known? Like, if Trump loses, I think actually probably a lot of that is priced into equities, so we might not see much of a bump. But the flip side is, and I think markets are undervaluing or underpricing, that if Trump wins this case, I don't think his tax power is going to end with tariffs. Like, I think we are, over the next couple of years, going to see him use IEPA to hit other parts of the economy for money. And I think that is something that, the Wall Street guys, at least, should be thinking about here.
All right, well, Peter, thanks for taking some time out of what I'm sure is a busy day, and we'll have to get you back on. It's a pleasure to have a fellow Georgian.
This is great. It's been great to be on. Thanks so much, Jacob.